By 1820, most of the Founding Fathers were dead, and Thomas Jefferson's party, the Democratic Party, had become the majority party in Congress. With this new party in charge, a change in congressional policy emerged. Recall that the 1789 law prohibited slavery in a federal territory. In 1820, the Democratic Congress passed the Missouri Compromise and reversed that earlier policy, permitting slavery in almost half of the federal territories. Several states were subsequently admitted as slave states, and for the first time since the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution, slavery was being officially promoted by congressional policy. Several other pro-slavery laws were also passed by Democrats in Congress, including the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. That law required Northerners to return escaped slaves back into slavery or else pay huge fines. In many instances, the law became little more than an excuse for Southern slave hunters to kidnap free blacks in the North and carry them into slavery in the South. For if a black was simply accused of being a slave, regardless of whether he actually was or not, under the Fugitive Slave Law, he was denied the benefit both of a jury trial and the right of habeas corpus, despite the fact that those rights had been explicitly guaranteed by the Constitution. Because the Fugitive Slave Law allowed free blacks to be carried into slavery, this law was disastrous for blacks in the North, and as a consequence of the atrocious provisions of this Democratic law, some 20,000 blacks in the North completely left the United States and fled to Canada. In fact, the Underground Railroad reached the height of its activity during this period, helping thousands of slaves escape from slavery in the South all the way into Canada simply to escape the reach of the Democrats' Fugitive Slave Law. In 1854, the Democratic-controlled Congress passed another law strengthening slavery, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, thus allowing slavery to be introduced into parts of the new territory where it previously had been forbidden, thereby increasing the national area in which slavery would be permitted. By the way, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Territory included not only Kansas and Nebraska, but also what is now part of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Therefore, by extending slavery into parts of the Kansas-Nebraska Territory, Democrats were pushing slavery westward across the nation, essentially from coast to coast. Following the passage of these pro-slavery laws in Congress, in May of 1854, a number of the anti-slavery Democrats in Congress formed a new political party to fight slavery and secure equal rights for black Americans. The name of that party? They called it the Republican Party. They called it that because they wanted to return to the principles of freedom and equality first set forth in the governing documents of the Republic before the pro-slavery members of Congress had perverted those original principles. One of the founders of that new party was U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, who had taken the seat of the great anti-slavery Senator Daniel Webster. Sumner had a record of promoting civil rights. In fact, he had championed the desegregation of public schools in Boston. Here is his argument before the state Supreme Court on that issue. In 1856, Sumner gave a two-day-long speech in the U.S. Senate against slavery. Following that speech, Democratic Representative Preston Brooks from South Carolina came from the House, across the rotunda of the Capitol, and over to the Senate, where he literally clubbed down Sumner on the floor of the Senate, knocked him unconscious, and beat him almost to death. According to the sources of that day, many Democrats thought that Sumner's clubbing was deserved, and it even amused them. It was 3.5 years before Sumner recovered his health sufficiently to return to the Senate. And not surprisingly, the first speech he delivered on his return to the Senate was again against slavery. In 1856, the Republican Party entered its first presidential election. In that election, the Republican Party issued this, its first party platform. It was a short document. There were only 9 planks in the platform, but significantly, 6 of the 9 planks set forth bold declarations of equality and civil rights for African Americans based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Democratic platform of that year took an opposite position, strongly defending slavery. In fact, it warned,
"All efforts of the abolitionists are calculated to lead to the most alarming and dangerous consequences, and all such efforts have an inevitable tendency to diminish the happiness of the people."
Amazingly, according to Democrats in 1856, attempting to end slavery would ruin the happiness of the people. Despite such clear differences, the Republicans lost that election. The next year, 1857, a Democrat-controlled Supreme Court delivered this, the Dred Scott decision, declaring blacks were not persons or citizens, but instead were property and therefore had no rights. In fact, quoting from this infamous decision, Democrats on the court announced that blacks
had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit.
In the 1860 presidential election, Republican Abraham Lincoln ran against Democrat U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Both parties again issued platforms. The Republican platform of 1860 blasted both the Fugitive Slave Law and the Dred Scott decision, and it announced its continued intent to end slavery and secure equal civil rights for black Americans. On the other hand, the Democrats in their 1860 platform praised both the Fugitive Slave Law and the Dred Scott decision. In fact, Democrats even handed out copies of the Dred Scott decision along with their platform to affirm their belief that it was proper to have slavery and to hold African Americans in bondage. It is worth noting that for over a century and a half, Democrats often have taken a position that some human life is disposable, as they did in the Dred Scott decision. In that instance, a black individual was not a life, it was property, and you could do with your property as you wished. Today, Democrats have largely taken that same position on unborn human life, that an unborn human is really just disposable property to do with as one wishes. African Americans were the victims of this disposable property ideology a century and a half ago, and still are today. Consider, although only 12% of the current population is African American, almost 35% of all abortions are performed on African Americans. In fact, over the last decade, for every 100 African American live births, there were 53 abortions of African American babies. Democrats have encouraged this. In fact, congressional Democrats are almost rabidly pro-abortion, and they consistently vote against protections for innocent unborn human life. For over a century and a half, Democrats have wrongly argued that some human life is merely disposable personal property, and black Americans have suffered most under this philosophy. In the 1860 presidential election, Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected with only 40% of the popular vote, but 59% of the Electoral College vote. Republicans also won a majority in the U.S. House and Senate in that election, thus giving Republicans control of the lawmaking process for the very first time. Given the bold anti-slavery and pro-civil rights positions set forth by Republicans in their platforms, it was obvious to Democrats what was about to occur. The anti-slavery and pro-civil rights position of the Republicans were about to become reality. What was the Democratic response? Southern Democrats left Congress and took their states with them, forming a nation that described itself as the slave-holding Confederate States of America. While Northern Democrats did not support secession, they nonetheless generally supported slavery and imposed civil rights for black Americans. In short, the main difference between Southern and Northern Democrats at that time was their view on secession, not slavery. Who were the leaders of that new nation of slave-holding states? Democratic U.S. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi became the president of this new slaveholding nation, and Democratic Representative Alexander Stephens of Georgia became its vice president. However, returning to the election of 1860, with Republicans firmly in control of the federal government, they quickly began implementing significant changes. In 1862, Republicans abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., and in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, freeing all slaves in the southern states in rebellion. In 1864, following the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, several civil rights laws and laws preparing to facilitate civil rights were passed. One of them was this bill establishing the Freedmen's Bureau. Another was this bill equalizing pay for soldiers in the military, whether white or black. The Fugitive Slave Law was also repealed that year over the almost unanimous opposition of the Northern Democrats still in Congress. While Republicans in the North were working to end slavery and secure civil rights, the new nation of Southern Democrats was determined to head in an opposite direction. In fact, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, the Democrat from Georgia, delivered a speech entitled "African Slavery, the Cornerstone of the Southern Confederacy." In that speech, Stephens first correctly acknowledged that the Founding Fathers, even those from the South, had never intended for slavery to remain in America.